What if the lullabies you grew up with were whispers from a past far more ancient and unsettling than you ever imagined? Tonight, we're falling asleep while unlocking the hidden depths of bedtime tales, revealing how these seemingly innocent narratives once wove threads of forgotten magic, primal fears, and even secret wisdom into the fabric of history. Long before there were bedrooms, there was night. Not the quiet electric night we know today, softened by walls and distant lights, but a deeper darkness, one that arrived suddenly and without apology. When the sun slipped below the horizon, the world changed. Shapes blurred. Sounds carried farther. And sleep, though necessary, became something that had to be carefully earned. In those earliest times, humans did not sleep alone. They gathered instead, close together, in caves, beneath overhangs of stone, or in small clearings where fire could be safely kept alive. The warmth of bodies mattered. The closeness mattered. But just as important as heat or shelter was something less visible, something carried on the air. Sound. A low murmur. A breathy hum. The quiet reassurance of another presence nearby. At night, silence could be dangerous. Silence meant separation. So voices filled the darkness, not with stories yet, but with signs of life. A cough answered by another. A soft call returned from the edge of the firelight. These sounds formed an invisible circle, one that said, "You are not alone." And within that circle, rest became possible. As generations passed, these simple vocalizations began to settle into patterns. Repetition emerged naturally. The same tones, the same rhythms, night after night. A hum that rose and fell like breathing. A chant paced to the slow sway of someone rocking a child close to their chest. These were not songs in the way we understand them now. They had no words, no names, no intention beyond comfort. But they worked. The human nervous system learned these sounds well. Even today, long after the dangers of the night have changed, the body still responds to gentle rhythm and low tone. A steady pulse slows the heart. A familiar sound softens the mind. What soothed us then continues to soothe us now. Fire played its part too. As flames flickered and settled, they created a space between waking and sleep. A small pause where the day could loosen its grip. Shadows moved softly along the walls, stretching and shrinking in time with the fire's breath. Someone nearby might begin to hum again. Not to entertain, but to hold the moment steady. This was the beginning of bedtime. Not as a ritual, not as a story told from start to finish, but as an instinct, a shared understanding that the night needed gentleness, that before sleep could arrive, fear had to be quieted. And the simplest way to do that was with sound. Infants grew calm more quickly when they heard them. Adults found their own thoughts slowing. As if the rhythm gave permission to let go. In this way, the earliest lullabies were born. Not sung, but felt. Passed down without ever being written. Remembered not by words, but by the body itself. If you were to sit beside one of those early fires, you might not recognize what you heard as music. But you would recognize the feeling. The way the darkness seemed to soften at its edges. The way sleep no longer felt like surrender, but like something you were being guided toward. Watched over by warmth, by sound, and by the oldest comfort humans have ever known. The feeling of being held in place by sound, of drifting while still protected. Children grew into adults carrying these rhythms within them. And when they became caregivers themselves, the sounds returned naturally. Almost without thought. A hum passed from one generation to the next. Unchanged. It already served its purpose. There was no audience, no performance, only the shared understanding that rest required guidance. That sleep did not arrive on its own. But needed to be invited. Slowly, patiently, and without force. In this way, bedtime became more than a moment. It became a tradition without words, older than language itself. A quiet agreement between the waking world and the dreaming one. And though the fires would one day be replaced by hearths, and later by lamps, and later still by softer lights glowing behind glass, the human need remained the same. To hear a familiar voice at the edge of sleep, to know that the night is being watched. Even now, when we lower our voices in the evening, when we slow our speech and soften our tone, We are echoing those ancient nights. Repeating a pattern shaped by countless evenings before us. A whisper, carried gently through time. Not every bedtime story was meant to last. Some were carried for only a single lifetime. Whispered into the dark and then allowed to fade. Long before stories were written down, they lived in voices alone. And voices, like breath, are temporary things. In the earliest communities, bedtime stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. A parent's voice became familiar to a child. And that voice carried not only comfort, but memory. Yet when a voice was lost, through migration, illness, or time itself, the story often vanished with it. There was no parchment to preserve it. No ink to anchor its shape. Only the night remembered. And the night does not keep records. Because of this, most early bedtime stories have disappeared entirely. What remains is not the story itself, but the space where it once lived. A pause, a rhythm, a habit of speaking softly when darkness arrives. Many of these lost tales were not gentle in the way we might expect. In a world closely bound to nature, bedtime stories often carried warnings. They spoke of rivers that should not be crossed after sunset. Of forests that listened. Of creatures that moved unseen beyond the firelight. These stories were not meant to frighten without reason. They were lessons shaped like narratives. passed along when the mind was open. And the senses were quiet. To understand the darkness in these tales is to understand their purpose. Danger did not rest during the night. And neither could awareness. A story that lingered in the mind could protect a listener long after sleep had come. In this way, fear was not the enemy of rest. But its quiet companion. Carefully measured, gently contained. Some stories warned of spirits. Others of animals, storms, or strangers. Often these figures were not named clearly. They shifted from telling to telling, adapting to the landscape and the time. What remained constant was their role. They marked the edges of safety. They taught where not to wander. They gave shape to the unknown. So it could be faced or avoided. From time to time, fragments of these vanished stories surface again. A line noted in the margin of an old scroll. A rhythm recorded by an anthropologist listening closely to a fading tradition. A brief chant remembered by an elder, shared just once before it was lost again. These fragments are incomplete, but they offer glimpses, like stars briefly visible through clouded skies. What they show us is not a single shared story, but a shared instinct. Across places and centuries, humans used bedtime as a moment to pass on knowledge too important to risk forgetting. And yet forgetting was inevitable. As writing spread, some stories were chosen to be preserved. Others were allowed to dissolve back into silence. The reasons were rarely deliberate. Sometimes the language changed. Sometimes a community moved. Sometimes the story simply fell out of use. Replaced by another that better suited the time. Still, the act of telling remained. Even now, when we cannot recall the words of those early tales, their presence lingers. In the way stories slow at night. In the way voices soften. In the instinct to warn gently. To reassure carefully. To leave space for rest. The forgotten fables may be gone, but the shape they gave to bedtime endures. A reminder that not all stories are meant to be kept. And that some are only meant to be heard once. In the dark, before sleep quietly takes them away. There is a quiet beauty in this kind of disappearance. Stories that were never written were free to change. To soften or to dissolve entirely when they were no longer needed. Their purpose was not permanence, but presence. Each vanished tale leaves behind a faint echo. A sense that something once occupied the space before sleep. And in that echo, we find the reason bedtime stories endure at all. not because the words are preserved, but because the act of telling, of listening, of sharing the night continues. As humans spread across the world, bedtime traveled with them. It crossed mountains and deserts, followed rivers, and settled wherever night eventually fell. Though languages changed and landscapes reshaped daily life, the need for comfort at the edge of sleep remained constant. And so, in every culture, bedtime found its own voice. In colder regions, where wind moved endlessly across open land, sound needed to be steady and deep. In parts of Siberia and Central Asia, low-toned singing emerged. Voices layered upon themselves, producing slow vibrations that seemed to come from the earth. As much as from the body. These sounds carried far in the still air, grounding listeners, anchoring them in place as sleep approached. Elsewhere, where nights were warm and shared among many, rhythm became the guide. In parts of West Africa, Gentle clapping or soft percussive patterns accompanied bedtime stories. The steady beat mirrored the pace of walking or the pulse of the heart. Offering reassurance through repetition. Children learn to recognize these rhythms instinctively. Their bodies responding before thought could interfere. In ancient Persia, bedtime took on a quieter elegance. Stories were shaped by poetry, spoken in measured lines that flowed like water. Imagery was favored over instruction, allowing listeners to drift among gardens, stars, and moonlit paths. Here, sleep was invited not through command, but through beauty. Though these traditions sounded different, their intentions aligned. Each culture shaped bedtime stories according to its environment, its values, and its understanding of the world. What mattered was not uniformity, but connection. A shared moment when the day loosened its hold. In some places, bedtime stories leaned gently toward morality. They offered guidance disguised as narrative, teaching patience, kindness, or respect for the natural world. Heroes were rarely loud or forceful. Instead, they succeeded by listening, waiting, or understanding when not to act. Villains, when they appeared, often represented imbalance. Pride that went unchecked. Hunger that ignored limits. Or a failure to heed warning signs. In other traditions, bedtime stories were less about instruction and more about continuity. They reminded listeners where they came from, who their ancestors were, and how the world came to be as it is. These stories were not meant to be analyzed. They were meant to be absorbed slowly and repeatedly. Until their meaning settled quietly beneath awareness. What is striking is how rarely bedtime stories celebrated conquest or noise. Instead, they favored calm resolutions, cyclical endings, and familiar patterns. Night was not the time for triumph, but for return. Stories often ended where they began, at home, near warmth, among those who watched over sleep. Across continents and centuries, bedtime became a mirror of cultural values, reflecting what each society held most dear. Yet beneath these differences ran a shared understanding. That the moment before sleep was fragile. That it required care. That stories told at night needed to soothe more than stimulate. Even today, traces of these global traditions remain. In the rhythms we choose, in the words we repeat, in the instinct to lower our voice as evening deepens. Whether through song, story, or simple presence, bedtime continues to weave together the many ways humans have learned to rest. A tapestry made not of thread, but of voices. Each one shaped by its place in the world. Yet all gently guiding the same journey into sleep. In many cultures, bedtime was not reserved for children alone. Adults, too, gathered near the slowing light of evening, listening as familiar stories unfolded once more. The repetition was intentional. A story heard many times didn't lose its power. Instead, it gained softness. Becoming easier to rest within. Some traditions favored stories without clear endings. Allowing the listener to drift away before the final words were spoken. Others repeated the same phrases night after night. Trusting that familiarity would carry the mind gently into rest. In this way, bedtime stories became a shared rhythm, marking the passage from wakefulness into sleep. Across the world, these rituals evolved independently. Yet arrived at similar solutions. Slower speech, simpler language, a narrowing of focus. The night asked for less, and bedtime stories responded in kind. Even when cultures changed, and new influences reshaped daily life, bedtime remained one of the last spaces to adapt. It held on to older patterns, longer than daylight hours ever could. And because of that, Bedtime stories became quiet keepers of cultural memory, preserving values and emotions long after other traditions had faded. In every place, bedtime offered the same gentle promise. That rest was allowed, and that the world would still be there in the morning. Though the world has changed, bedtime has remained. Walls grew thicker, fires became lamps. Lamps softened into distant, steady light. Yet the moment before sleep still asks for the same things it always has. Calm, reassurance, and a voice that moves slowly enough to follow. Modern bedtime stories may seem far removed from those earliest whispers by firelight. But they carry familiar echoes. The softened tone, the repetition, the sense of being guided rather than instructed. Even now, stories told at night tend to move gently, circling their meaning instead of pressing it forward. Beneath the surface, ancient fears and hopes remain quietly present. The dark is still unknown even when it feels safe. Sleep still requires trust. And so stories continue to offer it. Not by solving every worry, but by holding space for them until they loosen their grip. For children, bedtime stories help shape the first landscapes of imagination. Characters become companions. Settings become places the mind learns to visit without effort. But the influence does not end there. Adults too find comfort in stories at night. Even when they no longer think of themselves as listeners in need of soothing. The voice still matters, the rhythm still works. Psychologists tell us that stories heard before sleep linger differently than those encountered during the day. Without distraction, the mind receives them more openly. Emotions settle more deeply. Images drift gently into dreams, shaping how we feel long after the words themselves fade. Perhaps that is why bedtime stories endure in so many forms. In quiet audiobooks, in familiar phrases repeated each night. In the instinct to speak more softly as evening deepens. These habits are not learned deliberately. They are inherited. Each generation receives bedtime not as a rule, but as a feeling. A sense that the day must be gently set aside. And each generation reshapes it slightly, adding new voices, new stories, while keeping the same intention intact. Some families pass down the same stories for decades. Others invent new ones on the spot, told once and never again. Both belong to the same tradition. What matters is not preservation, but presence. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a voice is slowing. A story is finding its shape. And a listener is being guided toward rest. Just as countless others have been before.